Hi everyone, I know many of your names and faces. My name is Bree. I'm over at Indiana University, Bloomington. I've spent some time in a variety of places, but prior to this, I was at the University of South Carolina for 2 years as a postdoc. And then prior to that, I did my PhD over the pond at Cambridge with Liz Warburton, who's actually a stroke physician. And I was based at Addenbrooke's Hospital over there, which was a really great experience and environment to do a PhD in, taught me a lot. So without further ado, I'll just kind of share my slides, and hopefully there aren't too many of them. I promise to have a conversation, and that's the goal. So we will make that happen. But before we get there, just wanted to give a little background on me and some things that I'm interested in. So without further ado, we'll just jump in. Let me know if at any point my slides look goofy. So we'll just briefly introduce kind of my area of interest. I have 3 or 4, so I only picked one for this talk, but we'll just chat a little bit about spoken discourse, which is probably what most of you know me for anyway. I do dabble in some other things. In particular, I'm actually a neuroscientist by training. So I come from an area of being interested in neuroscience and its relationship to language impairment, and language recovery. I also study inner speech and gesture as, again, just little dabble things, because apparently I can't decide. But spoken discourse has been something I've loved for a long time. So that's what I decided to talk about a little bit more today. I wanted to be clear on what I'm not. So I'm not a clinician, and I'm not someone living with aphasia. So I rely a lot on my colleagues and people with lived experiences to make sure we're doing good work, useful work, reasonable questions that we're asking. So I always like to just be clear that I come from a place of basic science, and I've kind of moved to more translational science. And I'm always pushing myself to move even more toward kind of implementation, despite the fact that it scares me. I think we're eventually getting there. So that's just a clarification on who I am and what my perspective usually is. So I wanted to give some definitions for those who weren't aware of kind of what I mean by spoken discourse. In general, I tend to use the Armstrong definition. I like it a lot, which is language beyond a single simple clause used for a specific purpose. I think it's really important to define what we mean by discourse, because linguistics thinks of discourse in a different way than communication sciences and disorders. And so I like to kind of define it right off the bat. I'm particularly interested in monologue, so storytelling and things related to that. But there is also dialogue, so a shared communication. It's usually more structured though, kind of like an interview. And then of course there's conversation, which defines our everyday communication and interactions. And there are plenty of people in the aphasia access community who specialize in conversation. I am not one of those, just a full disclosure. And they've done some really great work in this area as well. So I've come from a background where I think about more of the structural stuff happening in discourse. And by that, I mean more of the kind of lexical level, phonological level, semantic level. But I am working with a lot of people that come from looking at a more functional idea of discourse, why it's used, what it looks like, how topics are organized. And so I want to be clear that both of those ways of looking at discourse need to happen. I just am someone who has traditionally looked more at the structure rather than the function, although that's starting to change thanks to some collaborators I've been working with. And the reason I got into this is during my PhD, I actually studied iPad-based therapy back in 2012 to about 2016. And I worked with individuals with aphasia who constantly said, you know, it's the conversation, it's the storytelling, and it's just more the social language that I really want to improve on. And so it inspired me to think about how we could measure that, how we could leverage, you know, naming treatments to extend to improvements in discourse. It just kind of ignited my whole interest in moving beyond single words to, you know, multiple word environments. And so that's the main reason I've stayed interested to this day. So something I wanted to highlight is that I'm not the only one who's interested in this and interested in improving it. There's been a huge amount of work in spoken discourse for at least 40 to 50 years. But the general consensus is that it is such a complex thing to look at. You've got many words, you've got syntax, you've got, again, form and function, what's happening, how are we using things, that it becomes very difficult to decide what to look at, decide how to measure it, and decide if those measurements are actually reliable and valid. And that's become one of these bigger issues, mostly because naming or single word, sorry, my phone is freaking out, single word things such as like naming treatments, single word repetitions, they have pretty good psychometric properties developed on them. They've been found to be reliable. Many people use them for treatment outcomes. But discourse, which is arguably the most natural thing that we do, really hasn't had a lot of the spotlight, because using it as an outcome measure, you need to show that the measure is reliable and valid in order to do that. And we've kind of had some trouble in that area over the years. And you can see that from some of the great titles here. I like the tipping point title in particular. And I talked a lot about this thanks to an Aphasia Access podcast that I just have a little screenshot of down below too. So point being, there were a lot of things that were being highlighted in the literature. I went through kind of a deep dive, figured out there's a whole lot of outstanding questions. And in 2019, Laura Murray, myself, Manaswita Dutta, and Lucy Bryant, who's based down in Australia, we kind of came together actually at a clinical aphasiology conference and decided that let's make a working group to see if we can answer some of these questions. We had no idea it would be popular, but it has gotten a lot of traction and a lot of great people involved. And it's what we call Focus Aphasia. The link is there for you. Everything is free that we do. It was kind of modeled after ACRM and ANCDS, which have kind of open membership structures where people can opt in to joining a group and doing a study together. Also, the CATS group, is the Collaboration of Aphasia Trialists, was another thing we modeled it after. Where basically people who were interested in the same question could find each other. They could choose to do an experiment together or write a paper together, et cetera. And we wanted it to be a space that was particularly focused on spoken discourse. And we wanted to also define aphasia pretty broadly. So I'm someone who has traditionally looked at stroke-caused aphasias, but we wanted to also include cognitive communicative disorders, for example, TBI, traumatic brain injury, as well as primary progressive aphasias. So our aphasia is defined very broadly here. When we first started, we had more of a structure, like steering committee are the people who kind of began the thing. Then we had some elected committees, which we called leadership teams. As we're moving forward, we're going to make this a little bit less structured in terms of nominating and voting, and more so that anyone who's interested can join, and then subgroups can kind of happen within those to look at specific questions, run an experiment, write a paper. Again, very much driven by what CATS is doing, which I think is a great model. So that's where we're going in the future. So to highlight kind of where we've been, I put together a little list here, which I told Jess I would send her all of these fun things. So these will all be available after. But we've done quite a lot in terms of publicizing what we do. We're currently writing 2 chapters for a new book coming out from Anthony Kong, who is himself a discourse expert in aphasia. And we've done, I think, 3 or 4 studies actually at this point over the past 2 years, of which I'll highlight 2 today, just as an example. And in the future, we're really hoping to get people to come together to answer questions that are interesting to you. All of these questions that we've answered, we heard from people that they were interested in. So that's why we've really, come together and looked at these things. And we understand that, questions and interests change. So that's why this conversation I'm excited about at the end. We'll talk about what you guys want. So just to highlight, I think, a few things here. The first one, which is my very favorite part of Focus Aphasia, is all of our free workshops and lectures, which I've just screenshotted a few here. This is a shortened link to our YouTube video. YouTube, I guess, playlist is a better way of saying that, where all of it is archived over the past 2 years. The most recent talk was from Dr. Gina Kike down here, who talked about Spanish speakers with aphasia, and it was absolutely riveting as someone who doesn't study that language. And I also love that she made some Encanto references throughout. I just finally got to watch that movie and it was great. So all of that is archived there, and we've got some workshops coming up too, which you can see in the top right. I'm really, really hoping that we can get some more clinical focus into some of these. We've had a few clinicians do some presentations, but it has been very heavily research oriented, and I'd really love some kind of feet on the ground presentations. You know, what has been working in your current environment? Why are you interested? What are you doing to look at discourse? So if you're interested in presenting, please contact me. I would love to have you. So let's talk briefly about a few things that we've done. The first thing that we wanted to kick off, because I said we want to do stuff that people are interested in learning about and fixing, is we kicked off a big survey to basically look at what the current practices were for discourse analysis, and in particular, what barriers are people hitting when they want to look at discourse and they want to analyze discourse in both a clinical and a research setting. So that was our first project as Focus Aphasia. We had a lot of people on that paper, which you can see in the top right, most of which were on our clinical aphasiology, like first ever meeting. So it was really exciting to work together. So I've just selected a few snippets here. Menasuita Dutta actually presented on this at the Academy of Aphasia this past year, and I do have her bigger slideshow. So if you're interested in more information, I'm happy to send that over as well. So to highlight 3 major findings, to just tell you a little bit about where future work went. The first thing that we found was that people didn't love transcribing data. That's not surprising. Other people have found that as well. And that is something we want to work on in the future, absolutely. But that a lot of people made clinical judgments, they used a perceptual rating scale, they used a variety of different things to look at what was happening in the discourse sample. So by that, I mean to measure something about structure, like mean length of utterance, or to measure something about form, like how well someone put the aspects of a story in the correct order. Right? Things like that are what I mean by analysis. But when we went on to ask a few more questions qualitatively, particularly about how people are doing clinical judgments and perceptual rating scales, most individuals said that they created their own, or they were using one that had been passed on from a fellow colleague, all of which are absolutely great, but the issue is replicating those findings and making those more available to others is a bit of an issue. And so replicability is something that we wanted to kind of focus on. Another thing that we found, we looked at some barriers. This is actually a barrier to data collection, which is in yellow, transcription, which is in blue, analysis in green, or data collection in purple, sorry, and then the others follow. The biggest issues that people cited, unsurprisingly, was a lack of time. Once they got a sample, which they said didn't take much time, it was a real issue to find the time to analyze it and make sense of it. And so that's kind of a crucial barrier to stopping people from doing discourse analysis. If you don't have time, you're not going to do it. So that was the biggest barrier that we found there. But also, we were looking down and saw that training and access to tools and resources was also pretty significantly endorsed by people, right? The respondents said that not a negligible amount of time. And so that made us think about, how can we create some training opportunities, which is what led to our free lectures. And then also, how can we give access to tools and resources, which is something that motivated creating some guidelines for publishing, which I'll show you in a second, and which has also contributed to creating some more tools like an automatic core lexicon analysis that Davida Fromm, Sarah Grace Dalton, and I I think 3 of Sarah Grace Dalton's students have now implemented in the CLAN software, which is free and a part of Aphasia Bank, which I'm happy to talk more about if you don't know what those are at the end. So we're trying to respond basically to these needs. Responding to time is obviously harder. We are working on, Sarah Grace and I are working together on creating a faster tool that people can use live when looking at Discourse. Check back in like a year and I'll let you know how that goes. And the last one I wanted to highlight in terms of kind of just a snippet of results is something that related to looking at what respondents said qualitatively. So we gave them a chance just to talk to us rather than just kind of answer 1 through 5 questions. And theme 1 was all about comparing across studies and across treatments, which is the issue I mentioned earlier, which is that discourse outcomes are super variable. People like different things, they pick different things, which is fine. But oftentimes those things are defined differently or measured differently by different people. And it's really then quite hard to actually replicate findings. And that's a bit off-putting, because if you're reading a treatment study and you say, oh, you know, they measured this thing, and then you try and measure it in your study and you're not finding that it works or you can't replicate it, just kind of reduces that confidence, I would say, right, in the results. So something we wanted to focus on was establishing some better ways that people could be more explicit when they're describing what they're doing in papers and other, you know, publications. And also thinking more about how we can improve what we know about validity and reliability of discourse outcomes. So those are some major takeaways, and I wanted to highlight one response item that, you know, we came together and thought about, which was creating some best practice guidelines. I'll just leave this up for a second in case you were wondering kind of major takeaways from that survey, but it's what I just briefly talked about, which is there are significant barriers. People like to look at different things in discourse, which is great. Many individuals wanted more information so they could replicate studies or at least be confident in replicating them, and that we needed to establish better psychometric properties like reliability and validity. So that's a general summary there. So I want to show you one of our responses, which is one of my favorite things that we've done so far. It just recently came out in Aphasiology, which is some best practice guidelines for reporting about discourse in papers. My team and I got inspired by quite a few different things. One was the Equator Network, which is an awesome network all about reporting standards based on what you're doing. So there's systematic review reporting standards, meta-analysis reporting standards, clinical trial reporting standards there. And also coming from a neuroscience world, there's been a really big movement to improve replicability of what we're doing with brain science. There's a group called COBITUS through the Organization for Human Brain Mapping, which created a whole standard of guidelines for how to report what you've done to make sure that someone else could pick up that paper and do the exact same thing. And so coming together, we wanted to create something like that, but specific to spoken discourse across kind of our broad definition of aphasia. So everything in terms of our study, which was a 3-part e-Delphi study, meaning we asked experts in the field of aphasia to tell us what is necessary to report versus what's recommended. We did it over 3 different time points, and we came up with a set of standards, necessary recommended standards. And if you click on that OSF link, which again, I'll send to Jess, it will take you to the survey responses, all de-identified, so you can actually look at the distribution there. And then it will also take you to a really cool table. It's in the file section that you can print out and use to write your paper. I'm using this right now to write one of our papers on a data set that we've had for about 2 years, and it's been incredibly helpful. This is my table that I created for that paper. So you can see on the right where I put, where I said that, for example, I've defined discourse. I did it right in the introduction. So this is something I'm hoping people will use and something that I hope is beneficial. When I was writing neuroscience papers and still do, I definitely use those COBITA standards to make sure that I'm adequately reporting things so my work can be replicated. And I really hope that this is something that gets some use as well. And just to end here, not too much more, because I do want to have a conversation. I have my own interests that are a little separate from what we've been doing in Focus Aphasia. I am someone who is really interested in the interaction of language with the task itself. So if you're familiar with something called TalkBank Project, which is part of Brian McWhinney's big kind of TalkBank umbrella, under which there's Aphasia Bank, Dementia Bank, TBI Bank, they created a bunch of discourse tasks that now 300 plus people with aphasia have actually done. So there's just a huge amount of language samples out there, which is great. I am interested in how language changes depending on the task demands. So when you ask someone to tell a story about their life, right, you're also asking them cognitively to engage their autobiographical memory system, right, to engage obviously their language system, versus when you ask someone to talk about how to make something, you've then really engaged more motor and visuospatial systems, right? How to, it's usually more spatial language that you then end up using. And so to look at that, I've done a few studies with some colleagues, one here at Indiana University called Julia, and then one where it was myself, but with a lot of help from the Aphasia Bank team, comparing across tasks and how language looked different. The main purpose for doing this is that, you know, most clinicians that I've heard from, and this is replicated in a variety of surveys, have time to collect a single sample of discourse, and usually it's a single picture description. Like from the Western Aphasia Battery, there's a little picnic that people describe, and that's where you get your discourse information from. Well, a picture description has really different cognitive demands than telling about your life or telling how to make something. You also get the benefit of seeing objects in front of you, which can help to access language in many cases. And so I was interested in, you know, learning more about the differences in language between tasks, because I think that's meaningful, because if you want to measure something specific, like more complex grammar or word access not visually accessed, then you need to choose the right task to do that. So that was the motivation behind looking at all of this. And I'm not the first person to be interested in this. Gloria Olness in particular has done some really great stuff in this area as well, Latowska as well. So I'm definitely not the first. But just to show you some cool stuff going on there, this is from the Fukuyama Stark paper that was on the previous slide. This is just individuals who are peers, so without aphasia, also from Aphasia Bank. And you can see some different colors down here with a word in the middle. The word is the task itself. So the sandwich task is a how-to story, how to make a sandwich. Important event is tell me about an important event. So it's more of like a narrative. It's drawing on autobiographical memory. Cinderella, everyone here knows, but it's a fictional story retell. You don't have any pictures in front of you. You're asked to do it from memory. The cat is a single picture. It's just one picture left in front of the person while they're talking about a man trying to rescue a cat. And the window is a sequence of pictures of a little boy kicking a ball through a window and upsetting a man. And the point of this is to say, when we look at language structure, like pronoun use, adjectives, verbs, prepositions, do these tasks look different? And they do. So you can see over here, sandwich is all by itself in this space. It produces a different proportion of, in particular, prepositions compared to most of the other stories. But you can see over here that some are more close together, like Cinderella and Important Event. They're both narratives and they both rely pretty heavily on memory. They're not seeing any pictures in front of them. So the language they're actually producing during those tasks looks pretty darn similar. And over here, cat and window, the speaker has the pictures in front of them. it might not be surprising then that those tasks elicit language structure that looks very similar, right? And so you see kind of these cognitive demands actually spreading out and showing how language is different, right, depending on task. So for example, if you're interested in looking at prepositions and how highly they cluster, maybe you do want to look at a sandwich task, right, versus something like a window task, just as an example. And when we looked at this in aphasia, I know this is a scary picture, but we'll talk through it. When we looked at it in aphasia, the first takeaway, which is at the top, is that these stories produce a similar pattern of language, no matter if a person with or without aphasia is producing them. And so the sandwich story, for example, looks very different from the pictures, right? So it's not just that we see this in individuals who are peers without brain damage. We also see this in aphasia, right? Task demands still affect language. And the biggest takeaway for us was that it's the only change that really affects how far the tasks separate is aphasia severity. Tiny bit of type, but really more so severity, where those with more severe aphasia tended to produce language that was similar across all tasks. Perhaps not surprising if, for example, their vocabulary is inherently limited, or they've got a limited amount of language available to them. Even with cognitive differences with task, the language is just what's available and it's not changing based on task. So that's something that was a main takeaway for us. So that's what I'm interested in terms of task. I also just wanted to mention that a pet project of mine that seems to be continuing is looking at some psychometric properties. And by that, I mean, if we test discourse twice in a small span of time, 10 days apart, do we see very similar language produced at those 2 time points? If yes, we can call those reliable outcomes, and they're pretty good to use as a treatment outcome because they're kind of similar at both time points. I had an ASHA Foundation new investigator grant to look at this. We're just about to push that out to hopefully be published. And then I'm working very closely with the Aphasia Bank team too to collect a much bigger sample to ask the same question. And the point behind this is very close to what Mary Boyle's worked on in some of her prior research, which is we need to figure out which metrics are the most stable and how those are influenced by task in order to really be able to use discourse as an outcome. So that's the general idea behind that. Stay tuned. It's been a labor of love and it will hopefully be out at some point. So with that being said, I hope I didn't talk too long, but big thank you to all of these people. I am definitely nothing without the team I work with. I have a fantastic team here at IU, and even more so around the world. I work really closely with people from the UK, Australia, and then all across Canada and the US. And that has been just huge, I think, for improving where we are with aphasia knowledge, and especially in discourse. The UK and Western Europe has had a very different approach to looking at discourse than the US has. I think they have come at it very much from more person-centered point of view, and the US now is on board with that. Kind of what do people with aphasia want? What is interesting to them in their discourse? And I think after a lot of the models, like the life participation approach to aphasia, have taken off here in the US, we're starting to ask similar questions like that. So it's been really fun to collaborate with those people as well. And then the Tavistock Trust, big shout out. I was a distinguished scholar, I think last year, and that's been really great to be able to be on the Aphasia Access podcast, and I've met a lot of great people through that as well. And I guess with that, I want to end on this slide and hopefully have a conversation. What can I answer or elaborate on? And then in particular, when Jess asked me to do this, I was like, oh yes, I need to learn from others. So I have a few questions for you all, which I would love to hear. So what do we need to do next regarding discourse sampling? So actually assessing discourse, getting that information. What do you want and need regarding research? And what can we support from a research standpoint? Hopefully those are just some lead-in questions. I'm happy to converse about anything else. But with that, Jess, I'll let you turn off the recording and we can have a little open conversation.